Welcome back. It is episode 175. I know the number this time. I am Jacob Harris.
Walsh.
This is all or nothing. We're smashing these out with our new little setup at the moment. Every single week coming through with the goods. Today is going to be sodium and potassium, and then we're going to talk about the effects that has in other areas, probably more so for people who are on the performance-enhancing drug side of things, which, I mean, come on. If you're listening to Connor, you know that that's got a little bit to do with why you're here. We can go into, what sodium and potassium does, but I feel like if you're listening, you probably have enough of an idea, but we know that they have a big role in hydration, and there's a lot of other things that happen, right? Obviously, we know too much sodium can be really bad. That's when your high blood pressure gang starts kicking in. And then if it's too low, then we're in dehydration land, headaches, nausea, dizziness, lots of other things that can obviously occur, but like they're the main ones we're aware of, right? Which is why we want to try and have a decent amount of it. Potassium is another one where obviously has a lot to do with muscle contraction, things like that. So if we're low on potassium, then we can start to have some not great stuff happen. Not necessarily say that your heart's going to stop, right, Connor? But it's like at the same time, maybe you could do if it's really low, right?
Or really high.
Or really high, which you would know a little bit about if you've ever listened to our previous episodes. Connor's tested the limit.
I have.
I guess the main thing to focus on with these things, because we know that they're, what their main kind of role is, it's more about, people will say electrolytes. But as we know, it's balance. Balance is the only thing. It's not the only thing that matters, but sort of kind of the only thing that matters, because there's no point in sort of just saying more is better or have heaps of this. And, like potassium's great, but if all you're doing is focusing on potassium, you're going to throw that balance out with sodium and vice versa and things like that. So maybe you could sort of weigh in on your ideology around potassium and sodium and how maybe it may be a simplistic approach you generally have towards it for yourself and clients.
So look, the main reason I kind of wanted to go into this is because I have heard a lot recently, had this question asked me a few times, and seen a bit of confusion around, how serum potassium is controlled. And then a lot of people being quite, perplexed as to why you can consume, for example, like me, I will consume somewhere between about 15 and 17 grams of potassium a day at the moment. A lot of people just don't understand how that doesn't cause hyperkalemia. And there are a lot of people, I think, that are directly drawing dietary electrolyte intake with what or how your serum electrolyte intake is controlled, like thinking the amount of electrolytes you consume directly controls the amount of electrolytes that are, maintained within your blood. When in reality, dietary electrolyte intake has very little to do with serum electrolyte levels, serum sodium, serum potassium, etc. This is predominantly controlled by the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So the kidneys will produce renin, which then tells, I believe it's the liver, to produce angiotensin 1, which is then converted in the lungs to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 binds to the angiotensin receptor, signals for aldosterone to be increased. Aldosterone then signals back to the kidneys to reabsorb more sodium. More sodium gets reabsorbed, more fluid, more blood volume, so blood pressure goes up. Yeah, so I just that was kind of the main thing I wanted to clear up there, that your actual electrolyte intake has very little to do with serum levels. It is hormonally controlled. Same to do with calcium and magnesium. That's a totally different system that controls that. We'll probably talk about that next week. Electrolytes tend to kind of act in pairs. Sodium and potassium are kind of the two pairings that you're going to look at most. And then you'll have calcium, magnesium, which have kind of push and pull in their own pair direction as well. Yeah, that's kind of the first part I wanted to touch on.
And so I guess then it comes down to for people who are either just like your everyday person versus like someone who's like super into performance, it's like the balance is it's really what's relevant, right? Like we said before, but so what does that look like in a diet, right? Because it's like a lot of the time we can sit there and be like, so for instance, I was speaking to someone a little while ago, I'm not going to name them, but I mentioned it to you and we talked about this because they said, coconut water is like shit for hydration. I found it interesting because I sort of understand where the idea is coming from, because it's like it's not particularly high in sodium. But I guess to me, the way I thought of that when I'm thinking about that, I'm like, okay, but it doesn't need, you know what I mean? It's like not like anything that hydration shouldn't just be like an electrolyte powder. That's not how we should think about it, right? Like it's across the board of what's happening. How much sodium are you consuming before or after training?
Exactly right, yeah.
because otherwise it's just like, well, if that's the case and everything has to have the perfect amount of something in it, then fuck it, I'll just drink fucking like electrolyte powder, and that's the only way I'll ever be hydrated. How is it? How do you approach that? Like when it comes to, like, say, before training, is we know that you've mentioned this before, from a carbohydrate and potassium perspective, you're generally you have coconut water in your intra workout. But you probably also, do you add salt to your intra-workout?
Depends. Most of the time I do. For me, I use the Aminos EAA. So most of the time I don't actually add salt, because there is, in 2 servings of their EAA product, 700 milligrams of sodium with it. Having said that, if I have decided maybe to sauna in the morning, or have been sweating more, or I'm getting feedback that my sodium levels are a little bit on the lower side, like cramps or something of that nature, then I will add additional in. As you mentioned prior, a lot of the hydration comes down to kind of across the entire day. So yes, sodium is the electrolyte that is predominantly lost in sweat. So that is where a lot of the, sodium pushing comes from, rehydration and having really high sodium electrolytes, rehydration solutions during training, like the LMNT or whatever electrolyte that's quite popular. It's got a gram or so of sodium. And look, there are cases, like particularly if you're in a very hot, sweaty climate, where if you are profusely sweating, there is going to be more sense of increasing sodium intake around training. In our demographic as weightlifters, it's very rare that we're actually going to lose so much sweat within a session that we are concerned about replacing that electrolyte loss from within the session. If you're a high intensity athlete who is fucking just going balls to the wall for 2 hours straight, in like an AFL game or something of that nature, it probably does make a little bit more sense to have more sodium intake there, because you are going to be losing a significant amount more sweat during that training session, and therefore sodium, as opposed to a powerlifter who's going to go to the gym and might sweat a little bit because they're overweight or whatever. But let's be honest, no one who is powerlifting should be profusely sweating for 2 hours straight during their training session. So the need there for replacing the sodium is going to be a lot lower. As you've mentioned, the potassium has a lot to do with muscle contractions. So keeping adequate potassium intake to ensure muscle contractions are able to occur properly is another important factor. And then with the carbohydrate intake around training, one, if you're using exogenous insulin, but even if you're not using exogenous insulin, the endogenous insulin that you're producing to control blood glucose in response to the carbohydrates being consumed is actually going to lower serum potassium. It has an impact on the sodium potassium pump. So what's going to occur is more potassium is going to be pushed from serum intracellular. This will kick some sodium from inside of the cell back into serum. So you will actually end up with higher carbohydrate intake. You are going to be pushing more potassium into the cell and out of serum. So potassium levels in the blood are going to get lower. So this is another reason why ensuring that adequate intake is there, so that there is not a supply issue during training, to maintain proper potassium status.
Yeah, right. And one of the other things, I just sort of briefly kind of touched on there, that there's multiple things happening there, but like obviously adequate potassium as well can control excessive sodium, right? Like, it can assist in the excessive sodium. So if you're having, like, let's just say for whatever reason someone's having extreme excessive sodium, which people probably aren't. But that being said, if you're a powerlifter and you've got a fucking horrendous diet, I mean, some guys will eat horrendously before they go to the gym. Potassium can assist with that, right?
Yeah, to a degree, maintaining fluid balance. Look, if you're going super crazy on sodium, you're probably not going to be able to potassium yourself out of it. But yeah, certainly to some degree, having a higher potassium intake will kind of allow you to get away with more sodium. But sodium and potassium intake is going to vary a little bit person to person. For example, a lot of performance-enhancing drugs that people use are going to increase sodium retention or reduce the amount of sodium excretion. So for a lot of enhanced individuals, sodium requirements are going to be a little bit lower than that for a natural individual. And this is something I kind of found out a little bit the hard way when I first got into a bit more coaching. I worked with a pretty even split of naturals and enhanced people to begin with. And when I was earlier on in my coaching career, I used to push sodium much higher, much closer to about a 1-to-1 ratio with potassium. And this tended to work relatively well for most natural performance athletes. However, like 9 times out of 10 with your enhanced athlete, when I followed that same electrolyte intake, we ran into blood pressure issues. So it's not going to be the same for everyone. Again, climates, the amount you sweat is going to have a big impact on the amount of sodium and potassium you consume. If you're living up North Queensland in the tropics, your sodium intake is probably going to be a bit higher because you're probably sweating a lot more. There's lots of different things that you need to kind of consider when thinking about kind of your optimal sodium and potassium ratios. A lot of people aren't going to notice a huge difference, but when you do definitely start getting into tracking performance metrics and stuff a little bit more closely, there is some pretty noticeable improvements that can be made in performance. And then stuff like blood pressure and health metrics, there is very profound improvements that can be made by controlling electrolyte intake properly.
Right. So I'm disappointed to hear that as someone who doesn't do powerlifting anymore. But when I did, that I was kidding myself when I was drinking fucking liter of Maximus while training to try and convince myself that I needed that. I needed a full liter of those, 80 carbohydrates and the limited electrolytes that were in them, just so I could get through my 3x3 set of squats and RPE 6 accessories with 9 minutes rest in between each set. It's interesting to know that I didn't need that. Kind of makes sense, really, when I think about it.
Look, I am still a big fan of intra-workout carbohydrates. There are still benefits around kind of maintaining stable blood glucose levels for cognitive function and whatnot during training.
But we can probably admit, Connor, that might have been overkill, considering that I was a fucking fat powerlifter anyway and was probably already consuming tons of carbs.
Possibly, but there's always a way to justify it if you try hard enough.
That's the powerlifter answer, so I appreciate that. I guess I want to touch briefly on quality as well, because that's the other thing, right? A lot of people, it's application here, and this is one thing I'm learning. I work obviously more with general population, not that you don't, but obviously you do work with a lot of athletes, but you can work with either of them. But the idea is that because I work with mainly general population, it's all, a lot of the time the information's like, yeah, cool, great information. How do I do it though? And where's the application? How do I go about that? So salt and potassium, I mean, salt's been a controversial one for years where people have argued about fucking salt quality and stuff for a long time. And I wonder if potassium's similar to an extent, but that's one I wouldn't know much about and I haven't explored. But we'll start with sodium. I remember sodium being a big one. You talking about it. I've seen Corey post about it before and things like that. People talking about the whole table salt's trash and, you should always have like pink Himalayan fucking salt and all this sort of shit. I guess I'd briefly like to just touch on like the quality of sodium and then maybe a bit on potassium. Is there a difference between some of these sources or do you think it's inflated?
There is no difference. Sodium chloride is sodium chloride. All these different salts, there's still about 98% sodium chloride. The differences that people fucking make out to be like these big game-changing differences, salt to salt, are in the, now wait for it, trace minerals. Now, what does trace mean? It means that there's so fucking little that they mean absolutely nothing. And people seem to not understand the meaning of trace. And they'll be like, oh, Celtic salt's so much fucking better because it's got potassium and magnesium and it's got so little in it that you would have to literally have kilos of the salt to get anywhere near your daily intakes. It makes no difference.
If you care about that, you may also care about the amount of protein in M&Ms.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah. Sorry, I had to interrupt you, but just to put it in perspective, if you're listening,
yeah,
now you understand how silly that is.
Yeah. In fact, if you even want to go further, the Celtic Salt have got a pretty large lawsuit against them at the moment for, I believe, heavy metal poisoning or contamination within their salts. So one would arguably say that your more processed table salts potentially are even better. Even with your iodized table salts, which do contain some iodine, there is some benefits there around bolstering iodine intake, particularly in certain diets that may not be as rich in iodine. It's less of an issue these days because we tend to get our fruit vegetable supply from different areas in the world, whereas back in kind of older times where a lot of, agriculture and everything was only sourced locally, there would be areas of soil which were less rich in iodine, so you'd have populations who would basically end up with iodine deficiencies, and then you get goiters and stuff of that nature, and thyroid issues. So there is definitely some potential benefits around actually using that iodized salt, particularly in certain demographics. But there's definitely no drawbacks to which salt you choose.
I'm going to do what any good general population person would do now and take some of that completely out of context because I heard the word iodine. And I just had a contrast CT and they pumped me full of iodine, so I must be topped up. It's the exact same thing, Connor?
Well, You would, you would actually, I assume your body would still take some of that iodine and metabolize it and store it and use it as iodine as you kind of would with any other injectable vitamin, like you would like an iron infusion or a B12 shot or anything of that nature.
Well, I had to piss a lot afterwards. They were like, drink as much water, and I was pissing a lot because I'd take care of my kidneys, bro. You know,
Yeah, it's not good for your kidneys.
Not good for your kidneys, which is good because then also the CT is just not good for you all around because of like radiation and kidney. Even if there's nothing wrong on the scan, maybe there will be on the next one. You never know. It's an inception loop of like nothing's wrong. You've created a problem. It just goes like this. I appreciate that with salt because, I mean, look, I like the Himalayan pink salt, but like not because there's anything special about it. I don't know, I just kind of like it. It usually looks a little bit nicer. You know, it kind of cracks as it comes. It's a little bit nicer to put on food, just in my opinion. But I don't think I've ever done it for the trace. I think I've just done it out of like a preference, and I would never spend tons of money on it. Quickly, because someone brought this up when I did the seminar the other week or whatever, and I actually know nothing about it. How does MSG work into this? MSG is a salt, no?
I don't look. I haven't really looked into a ton of MSG. I believe it's a human monosodium glutamate. I believe it's a human-derived, I guess, variation of sodium, but it's not something I know a whole lot about. I haven't seen anything concerning enough to really, I guess, warrant looking deeply into MSG. It's not something I've ever had a massive concern over. Having said that, I could have some oversight here, and I could be wrong, and maybe just something worth looking into, and I just don't know about it.
Right. Well, I don't know. I've never really worried about cooking with it or anything like that either. But
use it, but I certainly wouldn't care if there was a food I was consuming that contained it.
Shout outs to Uncle Roger. All right. Well, potassium, same sort of thing, right? I mean, it's like, would you say there's no real difference between supplemented potassium and natural potassium and things like that? Like,
well, for the most part, yeah, I do think that is the case. I do still think you're better off getting most of your electrolytes through dietary sources. There really shouldn't be a huge amount of excuse not to hit potassium intake if you're eating vegetables and eating like an adult.
Do you think there's a level of bioavailability that's still going to be better as well? Like, you know, look, a supplement's still going to work, but ultimately you're going to absorb more of it?
For most cases, yes, food can be a more bioavailable choice. A lot of the time you can kind of circumvent that by just consuming supplements with food because, you know, you're still getting the same, I guess, like, for example, if it's a fat-soluble supplement and you're consuming fat along with that meal, you are going to improve the absorption of that fat-soluble supplement.
No, I just wanted to touch on that. Obviously, it can be an important, like I said, application's a thing. We can sit here all day and talk about, you know, like any form of information. But if someone's just like, okay, cool, how the fuck do I apply any of this to me or anyone I know? Then they're just, people generally are going to be like, that's cool. People can Google information. So, obviously making sure that you get a good amount of actual food in, but then there are some kind of, I wouldn't call them cheat codes, but things to be aware of, like, you know what I mean? Coconut water being a huge one, right? Coconut water, it's like low in calories. The calories that are in it are carbohydrates. And then obviously, you know, the potassium is significant in coconut water. But also for me, if I think potassium, I think potatoes and coconut water. They're my main things I think of. You do have other things, like there actually is surprising amounts in little things like capsicum and stuff like that, but the problem with it is you're just not going to eat enough of that food.
Tomatoes, tomato paste, sun-dried tomatoes, they're all areas that I push pretty hard for potassium as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, not everyone can do that, Connor, right? And hashtag reflux gang. Tomatoes fuck my life up. But to be fair, sun-dried tomatoes seem to be okay. It's all very strange. I would say paste seems to be the worst. Any kind of tomato sauce seems much worse than actually tomatoes, which is very weird. PedTest Australia is a WA-based company providing at-home testing kits for a range of black market substances, underground or counterfeit drugs that can often contain a different substance than what they claim, or nothing at all. In 2024, 5% of oil-based steroids contained no active ingredient. Oral steroids were even worse, 12% contained no active ingredient. PedTest Australia kits provide a quick and cost-effective method of screening products before they are used. Kit results help users make informed decisions about substances they choose to take and therefore reduce the risks they are exposed to. Don't take chances with your health and gains. Test it before you take it. Go to pedtestaustralia.com to order your test kits. Bulk Gym Chalk Australia are your go-to suppliers for gym chalk. Whether you are doing powerlifting, weightlifting, strongman, gymnastics, or running a competition event and need bulk supplies and prizes, they've got you covered. Options include block chalk, bowl chalk, liquid chalk, or invisible liquid chalk for those gyms where you aren't allowed other options. They even have a range of athlete recovery bath salts to soak those training aches away. Check out the range at www.bulkgymchalk.com.au. Wonder why.
And tomatoes do have fructans in it, so they could be that that's causing it. But
It's the fructans.
Could be. As far as like kind of cheap potassium dietary adds, heart salt, light salt, so which is a sodium chloride, a sodium chloride and potassium chloride blend that's usually at around about 3-to-1 potassium to sodium intake. Tastes pretty similar to salt. There is very small difference in taste, but that is going to give you significantly more potassium than sodium, while still giving you the salty flavor of your food. And then cream of tartar is another pretty easy one that you can add to kind of, I guess, like yogurt meals or even in like egg whites and stuff of that nature, which is also going to make a pretty significant bump in just potassium intake with next to no. Yeah, you could very well throw cream of tartar in there.
If you're thinking that this doesn't look the greatest, I used to feel the same way. But once you start eating, that dripped out.
Oh, shit.
It dripped down on my keyboard. Once you start eating like a baby, you just never really go back. So
yeah,
every day I have my baby food to get me going. I know Connor's all about it because I've filmed Connor eat some foods that I used to think were fairly questionable, and now I eat a lot of them. One of them, quick shout out to you, just which was also a high potassium meal, so we're still on topic. I think we did it one of our things. You had like chicken, sourdough, sun-dried tomatoes, and there was like a couple of, and it was like a sandwich looking thing. And like, to be honest with you, an average person would be like, what the fuck is that? But I had it and it's fucking killer. And it was really high in protein. It was like 60 grams of protein or something like that, or 70 grams of protein. Really crunchy. I put some avocado in it, which is also not a bad potassium source. They're not like,
pretty good. Yeah,
pretty good. But once again, you're not going to eat like 2 avocados, it comes down to the serving size, but it was good.
See, avocados are one of my primary potassium sources that I use on rest days where I do have, quite a large fat budget. But yeah, for a trading day, if you're looking at like a potassium to calorie or a potassium to fat ratio, it is obviously going to be a lot more caloric and fat intake for the same potassium.
Other benefits there as well, right? Depending if someone's dealing with avocados high in soluble fiber.
I believe they're about a 50-50 between soluble and insoluble. They are a decent source of omega-3. They're pretty high in omega-6s. It's predominantly monounsaturated fats. Pretty decent source of vitamin E. Yeah, generally just a pretty solid food. And overall, they are a good fiber source.
I'm a big fan, but I'm a much bigger fan when they're in fucking season, right? Which is at the moment, nothing is in season and it's doing my head in. Avocados, berries, they're all fucking horrible at the moment. It's doing my head in. I've been living off gold kiwis.
I mean, they were hard to get not too long ago. They've only just started coming back around in the shops.
They fucking have. And you know what's bad when fucking Connor lives in Tasmania, right? Where you're like surrounded by people who probably grow the shit, in farms and stuff like that. So, if you can't get it, I'm struggling.
Yeah.
All right, drug talk.
Yeah.
This is less my ballpark, so I'm going to let you take over a bit here. What are we going to start with, and how are we applying this? You mentioned this before, sodium and potassium, and how does that affect us if we're using things like insulin, performance enhancing drugs?
Okay, so pretty much the majority of performance enhancing drugs, the growth hormone, all your androgens, are going to have direct impacts on the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So, for example, when you take steroids, you are going to signal to the kidneys more renin to be produced. There's then going to be more angiotensin produced. And now this is where, as enhanced bodybuilders, enhanced athletes, why ARBs and ACE inhibitors tend to be the go-to blood pressure medications to mitigate blood pressure increases from androgens and growth hormone use. Because they do directly impact the RAS system. And so an ARB is an angiotensin receptor blocker. So what this is doing is it's stopping angiotensin 2 from to binding to the receptor and having its impact on the receptor. So by doing this, you're then getting less signaling for aldosterone production. So there's then going to be less sodium retention at the kidney, which means more fluid is going to be excreted, and there's going to be less. So obviously fluid follows sodium. If more sodium is reabsorbed at the kidney, more fluid moves back into the blood. You have an increase in blood volume, so blood pressure goes up. So that is how a ARB works. By manipulating the RAS system to bring blood pressure back down. So you're effectively kind of combating the thing that the steroid is directly changing. The other class of drug that you have that is commonly used that also directly impacts the RAS system is an angiotensin or an ACE inhibitor, which stands for an angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor. You have angiotensin 1, which has less physiological impact on the body in terms of sodium retention and stuff like that, which then converts in the lung via angiotensin converting enzyme to angiotensin 2. The angiotensin 2 is what has the main impact on the body in terms of then signaling to for more aldosterone production. So the ACE inhibitor stops the enzyme being able to convert the angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. So you just have less angiotensin 2 available to bind to receptors, which means you have less kind of impact on that receptor. There's less aldosterone produced. So again, less sodium is reabsorbed at the kidney, less fluid makes its way back into serum, less blood volume, lower blood pressure. Sodium and potassium are opposite. That is kind of why you're going to get an increase in potassium levels potentially. Having said this, one of the biggest issues I see with blood pressure medication use within enhanced individuals is they read the label warning that comes on most of the ARBs and ACE inhibitors that says something along the lines of do not use potassium supplements or don't overconsume potassium. And their first kind of response is just to tank dietary potassium. They get scared of it. They think they're going to go hyperkalemic, and now they're effectively undoing part of what the drug is actually doing in the first place. Obviously, as we've mentioned, potassium and sodium work oppositely. If you go out of your way to consume less potassium, you're just kind of obviously the kidneys still have the main impact, but if you tank potassium to the point where you have a supply issue to maintain serum levels, then dietary electrolyte intake is going to have impact on stuff like that to a more significant level. When there is relatively, sufficient levels, the body should be able to maintain things a lot easier through stores just by manipulating the different hormones. When you begin to run into issues, I guess you look at it like you've got a house and you've got bricks, you've got builders. As long as there's bricks, those builders can keep moving those bricks around and making the house and doing whatever they want, doing whatever they need to do with it. If at some point the bricks, which is the potassium from the dietary source, runs out, and now you've still got all these builders here, but you've got no bricks. So what are they going to do? Kind of that's the best, analogy I could put it in. As far as the hyperkalemia aspect goes, still, look, if you added a blood pressure medication in, you should be getting kidney checkups anyway. You should be monitoring serum electrolytes. If your kidneys are healthy, they will continue to maintain a healthy serum level of potassium. Hyperkalemia is not something that you'll have an issue with. If you do start to have diminishing kidney functions, something that you do unfortunately see a little bit more commonly with bodybuilders towards the end of their career, where maybe they're not seeing, particularly large skewing in kidney-related health markers, but there might be some small underlying issues that are beginning to occur, like within the nephron and stuff, that's not yet showing, like creatinine elevations or cystatin C or albumin in the urine, for example. But there is mild dysfunction there. That's where potentially you could start to see things like some hyperkalemia starting to set in. That could be potentially early warning or an early indicator of some kidney dysfunction occurring. But generally speaking, hyperkalemia directly from high dietary potassium along with blood pressure medications is not a concern, and having the higher dietary potassium is generally also going to actually help with improving the blood pressure alongside the medication.
Interesting. Yeah, it's obviously, it's like somewhat niche, right, to an extent. It's like not niche, but like obviously it's going to be applicable to the right people. But as you said, it's that the part of that is the issue why the I may say lack of information, but like there's not obviously a lot around it in terms of like the perspective that you're mentioning. Obviously a lot of things, especially blood pressure medications or medications for cholesterol and stuff, it's a lot of the time it can just be like, here you go. And then there's not a lot of explanation as to like maybe what the stuff around that should look like. Because people just assume like, oh, this medication will just do the thing. And then as you said, there's other precautions that sometimes are taken that can actually make things worse. And there's probably more examples of that across the board, where someone will be like, oh, I'm going to do even less of this, for example, or I'm going to be careful of this. And then it can, I mean, like, not that you would use this as an example, but let's say for whatever reason someone is having problems with blood pressure, so they're watching their sodium intake, and then all of a sudden, like, they're eating incredibly low amounts of sodium to the point where it's like they're not salting any of their food and they're staying away from any food that has salt or anything in it. That can obviously have another effect that they're not. I mean, this isn't the same thing, but I'm just putting it in perspective for someone who maybe doesn't completely understand what you're saying, that balance, like we mentioned at the very start of this, like, is going to matter across all these kind of situations, and there needs to be a level of monitoring. And I think that's the overall kind of thing we're mentioning here, is that, as you said, it's about monitoring it and then making sure that you're kind of actually paying attention to these levels, and maybe you need to adjust them, maybe you don't, or maybe you just need to work with someone like yourself where they can actually try to understand those other small areas of it. Because a lot of the time, it's very similar to what I said about this podcast. We're talking about information. A doctor can just be like, here's a medication, here's a general gist, there you go. And then someone can go away with that in their head. And then, like you said, their immediate thought is, oh, I'm going to start consuming less of that or more of that. And then there can be other consequences for that that aren't really making a lot of sense. And I don't completely understand blood pressure medication because it's not something I've ever worked with before, but it's pretty common. So yeah, it's very common. Yeah.
And to be completely honest, probably should be more common. I think there's probably a very large percentage of people, probably 1 in 5, I would say, that are hypertensive that just don't know because they don't check.
Yeah. Well, and then also it can be, that's another monitoring thing, right? Because it's like when they do check, it's like, once every 3 months when they go to the doctor, and then they strap it around their arm and they're like sitting down in a chair and they've been talking to them for 15 minutes or whatever. And, who knows, maybe that day it's just not as bad or something like that. But you and I both know that if you really want to get accurate readings for blood pressure, I mean,
stuff, yeah.
Yeah, look, and it should be, I mean, my approach has always been the morning. You still stand by sort of like when you wake up, maybe 15 minutes after you wake up without doing anything, or?
No, my approach is to take blood pressure at multiple times of the day and track it and see what's happening at different points of the day.
Right, okay.
My clients take a mixture of AM and PM readings because you will get isolated hypertension, particularly in people that have stress-related issues, maybe circadian rhythm-related issues. There are people who will be hypertensive in the morning and they'll be hypertensive in the afternoon, but normotensive at other points of the day.
But given that, like, I guess from an average person perspective, you're not expecting someone to do it multiple times a day, every day, for an average person who's had
multiple times a day. I'm saying one day you might do it in the morning, and one day you might do it in the afternoon, and
right, okay.
One day you might do it at midday.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, everyone should be taking it at different points in the days, especially in today's day and age. A lot of hypertension is stress related. A lot of people will wake up in the morning with no stress and be normotensive. By the time they get to work at 9 a.m., they're fucking hypertensive for the rest of the day.
Interesting. Does that necessarily, like, where does management come in there though? Is management medication, or is it?
It can be stress management.
Yeah.
Depends on the individual and the situation. Sometimes stress management's not possible.
Yeah.
That's the first thing you'd want to look at. But if you're working a big corporate job and you're dealing with fucking $1 million deals, and you've got clients ringing you at 3 a.m. and look, sometimes that's just life, and that's what you have to deal with stress-wise. And sometimes you just have to look at alternative ways that you can control or mitigate health risks. Obviously, you probably wouldn't want to stay in that career forever. And if you do, you probably want to hope that the income is worth the likely loss in lifespan. But yeah, sometimes you just can't remove stresses, and that's something that some occasionally you'll have to find an alternative way to mitigate that harm. Everything's a trade-off, right, in life. So if you're willing to do that, well, that's taught me something a little bit about blood pressure then. So that's always one to admit that I've learned something. And so, yeah, I mean, for me, it was always just like a general checking situation. And generally people are usually okay. And if someone has absolutely no symptoms or any, and some people will have just be the kinds of people where they're like, I feel fine, and every time I check it, it's fine. And, to an extent, you're not going to
force it upon someone who doesn't seem to be experiencing any real issues, or they're incredibly stress-free or something like that. But as you said, it can still be super important. You have that person has no idea what's going on, but it comes back to the exact same thing. It's monitoring. It's monitoring anything. Same as bloods, because this is the same example, right? It's like, oh, I don't get bloods because I feel fine. It's like, well, that's not really how it works,
Not how it works at all.
No. All right. We're trying to keep to this, so we're not going to go too far over. We'll keep it there. Next week you mentioned calcium.
Yeah, I reckon calcium and magnesium probably makes sense to do next week. We could probably talk about some of the other blood pressure classes. A little bit less applicable with the bodybuilding demographic, but it kind of still gives you a good understanding of how things work on a physiological side of things. Very similar hormonal pathways. It's just, again, completely different, controlled by the parathyroid. So a lot's the same, but it's also completely different. Similarities in the way that they pair, but the mechanisms and the way that the body controls the levels is completely different between the two.
And what you thinking drug-wise? Because I know people want to know that.
Well, we could look at calcium channel blockers from a blood pressure side of things. In terms of performance-enhancing drugs, I don't. Yeah, there's not going to be anything I can really think of off the top of my head that is going to have significant changes.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
We'll come if we come up with one, we'll come up with one on before next week. But we're trying to stick to a bit of a schedule with these, keep them nice and short, so you guys can listen to them, and also I can get them out. Last one, it's not about getting tons of views on these. It's about us being consistent and getting them out week by week and keeping them up. So that is going to be us for today. I'm Jacob Harris.
Connor Walsh.
This is All or Nothing. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week.